Kia ora, my name is Mark Treadwell and welcome to chapter 3 of the book. And in this book we're looking at learning, and this is a shift in our focus really away from the focus on teaching to what is the learning process and what does that look like and how does our brain actually learn. In the previous video we introduced the notion, in the previous chapter we introduced the notion of the cellular changes that take place in our brain and what that actually means to us as an individual. In this one we want to look at our first thing we've got to learn when we're first born, and that is to be able to sense our world, and in a bit more detail. We talked about our 23 senses and they're listed in the book, you can go and have a look at those. But what we want to also look at this point in time is what thinking actually is. And we define thinking as any activity that changes your worldview in some way, shape or form. So new information that comes in that changes how you view the world and how you see the world and what you know and understand about the world. So that's our definition of thinking, and we sort of talk about it in more detail in the book. But also we need to understand that our senses are not reliable. Okay? Our senses sense our world and we interpret that data in different ways. So for example, if we think about eyesight as an example, eyesight is very interesting because we tend to think that in our imagination we can see pictures, but the truth is you can't see pictures in your mind. It's a physical impossibility. The reason for this is quite simple, and that is to see pictures in your mind you'd need to see a screen in your eye and inside your head, and then you need eyes to actually see the screen inside your head, and so on and so on, and this is not possible obviously. And we know you cannot see pictures in your mind because if you took a book and opened it up, looked at it, closed it, and then I said to you, okay, read me back the page, you should be able to, if you can see pictures in your mind, you should be able to get that picture back in your head and reread it to me, and you can't. And there is no such thing as photographic memory, right? There just is not. People have very good memories, but that comes at a cost, and we'll talk about that later on. All right? So if you're very, very good at remembering, then you won't be very, very good at all at actually forming ideas and concepts. You have one or the other. You can't have both. All right? And so we'll talk about that later on. We'll talk a little bit about autistic children and what that means for them. So if you can't see pictures in your head, okay, how does that thing work? How do you make sense of that sensory data? And this is a philosophical as much as a biological sort of approach to life, really. What we can do in our heads, though, is something much better than actually forming a picture. If you think about your grandmother and you sense what she was or is like, then when you sense your grandmother, you don't actually form a picture of her. You form something much more vital. You can actually have that sense of smell of your grandmother, of the experiences, how you felt when you were with your grandmother. All right? All your senses, your 23 senses, give you a sensory set of feelings around your grandmother. And this is incredibly powerful, much better than actually having a photograph in your head. All right? So the first thing most people do when someone passes away is we get a picture of them somewhere so we can remember them. And you wouldn't need that if you could form pictures in your head. Right? So when we talk about our senses distort our world. Right? And we see and feel and react to different ways to our senses. So in this section here we go through some quite detail about how we see. We also introduce the notion of each of our senses to some degree can do the jobs of the other senses. So for example, your tongue, for example, we can use your tongue, if you're blind and you can't see, we can actually use your tongue to give your brain sensory data around what's outside there in the world. Okay, and it's sort of hard to believe, but if you put cameras into a pair of glasses, okay, take the raw feed from those cameras, place it onto a small disc, place that small disc on your tongue will interpret that data and eventually link it to imagery to the point where you can actually read and write using your tongue, which is bizarre. But once again, have a look at the video in the book and follow that track of thought if you want to. But our senses are really interesting in that they are equitable for everybody. So our first learning system, our senses, is equitable for everybody. Everybody pretty much has the same level of eyesight, hearing, taste, touch, balance, etc. There are small differences, but we haven't got a big distribution curve. It's a fairly narrow distribution curve, and it's up this end of the spectrum. Right? So our senses are pretty much given out to everybody equitably. Okay. The last thing I'd like to finish with in this chapter is looking at this notion of our brain and how it's put together. When Einstein came along, he saw the universe through a very different lens. And he looked at it through the mechanical lens, which Galileo and others before him looked at, and he said, well, maybe not. And this is the same thing we have to do with our brain. Increasingly now we're starting to realise that fMRI and MRI scanning is nowhere near as reliable as we thought. And so those pretty pictures of our brain, which are fantastic, but they actually probably are not that accurate. And what we're starting to realise is that eyesight, for example, we tend to think of that as our occipital lobes down the back here in our brain, and that's where seeing happens, and that's probably not the case. In other words, the data set from all our senses gives us a data stream as opposed to individualising those senses. So increasingly we're looking at our sensory package as opposed to discrete senses happening in different places. That's it for chapter 3. Pop and have a read and catch up with the references, etc. in the book, and then we'll come back and we'll talk to you more in chapter 4. Thanks very much.